Welcome everyone to Adventures with Clive. Well, it's finally here after years of testing, refining, and perfecting. Baldur's Gate 3 has been released. In this series we will walk through Baldur's Gate 3, going over as much of the content as we can do in a single playthrough. However, there are some decisions that we will have to make along the way, and that will limit us to the content that we do experience. So I'll try my best to explain the impact of the bigger decisions, but some of the impacts aren't felt until much later in the game. So in an effort to experience as much as we can, it will require a few walkthroughs with us making decisions based on whether we want to be good or evil characters. So this first walkthrough will be based on us aligning with goodish characters and companions so that we can get that perspective. And as for this episode, due to the depth of character creation, I've had to split it up between two parts. So this part will contain pretty much everything in character creation except for classes, and the class section alone is over an hour of content, so I felt it best to split it up so that we can digest it in elephant-sized bites instead of in whale-sized bites, which is still fairly big. So for this episode you will see general information about starting a new game, as well as information on origin characters, selecting your race, backgrounds, skills, and abilities. And in the next episode, you will see a very comprehensive guide on selecting your class and getting an overview of what that class will do and what it plays like, as well as some additional information about your protector and some other things you have to do before starting the new game. Alright, so one other important point I wanted to make about the design philosophy involving decisions within this game. There are quite a few failsafes to protect you within the game, and this should really encourage you to explore the game without feeling like you will make a huge mistake and it will prevent you from completing the game. So one simple example of a failsafe is that in the beginning you're presented with choosing a difficulty, and it's one of three difficulties from easy, medium, and hard, and that decision doesn't really matter that much because you can change the difficulty at any point in the game. So if you encounter a hard fight that you are struggling with, you can just reload the game at your last save and then change the difficulty and then complete the fight and then go back to the difficulty you were originally. And there are many more failsafes in the game, such as respeccing, protecting important plot characters, and being able to hire replacement party members in case you mess up with all of your companions. So the main point is that while these choices are impactful, they are done in such a way that you can play the way you want to play, and it will never put the game in a state where you can't complete it. And I will also try my best to explain the major choices and what the consequences will be as we journey through the Forgotten Realms. And one last thing I wanted to mention before we get started is I do plan on showing all the cutscenes, with the exception of anything that is explicit, because that does violate YouTube's community guidelines, and I don't believe anybody's going to get away with showing those scenes because they are pretty explicit. I did turn off the nudity setting, so we'll have to see how those cutscenes turn out before I actually try to show them in a video on this channel. Alright, so let's get started with the new game. And we have the option to choose a difficulty from incredibly easy, more RP, to normal and tactician. Tactician is a pretty good jump in difficulty over balanced. I'm going to stick with balanced. Alright, so let's go on to the character creation screen.
must gather your party before venturing forth.
Alright, now that we have made it into the character creation screen, I wanted to start off by mentioning what can and cannot be changed after you start the game. So this is always subject to change with a future patch, but at launch, these are the limitations. So you cannot change your race, your appearance, your background, or your protector after leaving the screen. You can, however, change your class, your subclass, and skills and abilities. Alright, this is the first option that we get to choose from. Do we want to play one of the companions, or do we want to create a completely custom character? That is what we have to choose first. I will be playing a custom character, but if you want to play one of the companions, you have a choice from any one of the 6. The Dark Urge is actually a custom origin character that has its own backstory. One interesting thing with this is that you can play an introduction to the character, which kind of gives you a background of who they are and how they came to be there. Some interesting things about that is that some of these characters benefited from getting the tadpole implant in their eye, like we saw in the cutscene. So it kind of broke some of the powers that were held over them. Another interesting thing that I saw with the stories is that it's like the tadpole was forcing them to tell their story because how they react. So those are all interesting little details that were added to the game, which I find amusing. So each one of these has their own story, and so you can kind of get a really good idea of what kind of character they are, like what is driving them to do the things that they're doing. And I would recommend watching them just for entertainment purposes, at the very least. Okay, so on to our origin character. We have a few things that I wanted to mention before we get started with customizing our character. On the right side here, there is this panel. It gives us information about the character, and this is based on kind of the race and the class that we pick, and also our background. So as we choose those options on the left side, it will change this panel here, and so we can use this panel as a reference for what proficiencies we're gaining, kind of what our actions and spells are, and what stats we should be going for. And also it even tells us what our initiative is and what our hit points are. So a few more details about what these things mean. These are our abilities. They're kind of like stats. They essentially give us bonuses when we roll. So as we see here, if we hover over strength, which has a star, which means it's our primary ability based on our class. If we hover over strength, we can see that we get +3 to strength checks. So anything that's a strength check or a skill that is based off of strength, it will allow us to add +3 to our dice roll. So as we get into the different proficiencies, I'll talk a little bit more about what these rolls actually mean. But just for a little context, this is essentially what we'll be looking at when we start customizing our character to get an overall view of what we're gaining when we're making our changes. Another thing is, you do not want to hit proceed. This will actually start the process of starting the game. So we do not want to hit proceed unless you want to start the game. Edit appearance, proceed, and this section here with body type, these all will stay here permanently. So you can make changes to these at any time throughout this process. So we don't have to worry about changing our appearance at this moment right now. We can kind of go through and then change it towards the end if you wanted to. Only that does change as we go through the options on the side is this screen right here, which currently displays origin. All right, so let's take a look at the races.
You must gather your party before venturing forth.
Okay, so a few things about the races is that at launch, the races do not provide any ability points for your character like it does in 5e and like it did in the early access version of the game. So these ability points on the right here do not change based on your race. They are tied to your class. So your race primarily affects more of the role play of the game, how NPCs will react to you, and how your character will go throughout the game and interact with other different races. Some races aren't very fond of other races, so you will have to do a little bit more to gain their trust and things like that. And another important thing to note is that you cannot change your race by respeccing. That's one of the few things that is going to be the same throughout the entire game. So you definitely want to make the choice of your race more on the RP and what you think will best suit your gameplay. There's a little bit of min-maxing with some of the stats, particularly like half orc gives you bonus crit damage. So you can go that route, but I would just recommend kind of playing it for RP. Just playing a race that you find yourself wanting to enjoy. And another very important thing is that you will see your character's face a lot in the game. There are a lot of cutscenes, so be sure to pick the race and character and customize it the way you want to see it, because if you don't like your character's face, you're not going to enjoy the game as much. So also keep that in mind, and I would put that above picking a min-maxy type of way to play the game, because the aesthetics of your character will be a huge role in the enjoyment of the game, since you will see a lot of cutscenes with them. So with that out the way, let's go through each race and see what they offer, and also the sub-races that are tied to them. Okay, so the first race we will take a look at will be the Elf. So the Elves, they get the race feature of 9 meters per turn as their base speed, which is kind of standard for medium-sized characters. They also get proficiency in swords and bows. So proficiency means that they get a bonus when they attack with these weapons. I wouldn't worry too much about these specific proficiency bonuses, because you most likely will also get proficiency bonuses from the class you pick. So sometimes there's overlap where you'll get, long swords and bows if you pick like a ranger, for instance. So this is not too big of a deal, because your class will kind of drive those proficiencies as well. Elves also get dark vision, which means they can see in the dark up to 12 meters. If you don't have dark vision, you will need to rely on some other method of lighting up the area in order to actually hit you with your spells or attacks from ranged. So dark vision definitely is helpful for hitting things. A lot of races get dark vision, but also isn't that big of a deal. They do get Fey Ancestry as well, so which means they get an advantage on saving throws against Charmed and Sleep. So if you are attacked with a spell that will put you to sleep, you can roll 2 dice, and the higher those 2 dice will go towards your saving throw, and if it meets the criteria, you can avoid being put to sleep. So that is also a nice little bonus, and this applies to all elves. There are 2 sub-races of elves. There is the High Elf and the Wood Elf. The High Elf gets a cantrip, which you can change. So if you want to change your cantrip, you click on the button below. You can't click on this and change it. You have to actually click on this section over here, and it lets you pick from any one of the cantrips. There's a wider range of cantrips. Other classes will also get cantrips, but most of them aren't changeable. The High Elf will let you change them, so which is a kind of a bonus. So as far as the Wood Elves go, they really just get the extra 1.5 meters of movement speed. So that puts them at 10.5, which I believe is the fastest of any of the races and sub-races. So this is a nice little bonus if you want to move further per turn. Alright, the next race on the list is Tiefling. Tieflings get 9 meters per turn in movement speed, which is standard. They also get dark vision, just like the elves do. And they get the specialty Hellish Resistance, which halves the damage they take from fire. So kind of a nice little bonus if you're fighting creatures that do fire damage. For sub-races, your options are Asmodeus, which gives you a cantrip. This cantrip cannot be changed. So this cantrip is Produce Flame. So Produce Flame essentially just, you create a flame and you can use it to light up an area, or you can throw it to do damage. The next one is Mephistophelius, and they get the Mage Hand cantrip, which is very useful for a lot of situations in and out of combat. And then you have Zariel Tieflings, which they get Thaumaturgy. Thaumaturgy is helpful in conversations. It gives you an advantage to intimidation and performance checks, and an advantage means you can roll 2 dice and take the better of the 2 dice to pass the check. So this is a neat way to gain a bonus. Alright, the next one on our list is the Drow. The Drow has a base racial speed of 9 meters. The Drow weapon training gives you proficiency in rapier, short sword, and hand crossbow. And then you have superior dark vision, which lets you see twice as far as elves and tieflings. So 24 meters, very handy in low lighting situations or in caves. And you also get Fey Ancestry, just like elves, where you gain an advantage to Charmed and Sleep. So for the subraces, you have two options. You have the Lawless Sworn Drow and you have Seldarine Drow. There are no bonuses associated with either one of these. So the difference between the Lawless Sworn and the Seldarine is going to be more role-playing based and how NPCs react to you. You're going to get more favorable reactions from Seldarine Drow than you will with Lawless Sworn Drow. And likewise, if you're a Lawless Sworn Drow and you're in the Underdark, you'll probably get more favorable reactions there. Up next is humans. So humans get 9 meters per turn in movement speed. You also get Silver Militia, which is weapon proficiencies in spears, pikes, halberds, and glaives. They also get light armor and shield proficiencies. And they get human versatility, which means you can get an additional skill to be proficient in. And your carrying capacity is increased by 1/4. I think the carrying capacity is probably worth taking if you're going to be like a loot goblin and want to grab everything. Humans have no subraces, so you cannot choose one of those. Next is the Githyanki. The Githyankis, they don't have any subraces, just like humans. They do get an action, which means this can be used once per long rest, and it gives you proficiency in all skills for a chosen ability. So essentially it's a temporary bonus that gives you a wide range of proficiency in skills, which can be handy in many situations. They also get the cantrip of Mage Hand, which is intellect based, and they get the bonus racial speed of 9 meters per turn, and they get proficiencies in light and medium armor, as well as in short swords, long swords, and great swords. So all of your swords. Alright, up next is Dwarf. Dwarfs get 7.5 meters per turn, so they are slower than humans and Githyanki and Drow and the other ones. They have smaller legs, so their movement speed isn't going to be as quick, just like the other races that are smaller. They get Dwarven combat training, which is proficiencies in axes essentially and hammers. They do get dark vision, which is 12 meters, and they get Dwarven resilience, so you get advantage to saving throws against poison attacks. So the subraces, there is the Gold Dwarf. So Gold Dwarves start out with 1 extra HP, and it also increases by 1 every time you level. So a minor increase to your HP. Shield Dwarves, they will get a armor proficiency in light and medium armor. And then Duergar, they get superior dark vision, just like the Drow. And they get Duergar resilience, so they get advantage to saving throws against illusion, charmed, and paralysis. Okay, now we have Half-Elf. Half-Elf is the combination of elf and human, so you got a mix of those features. So they do get 9 meters per turn. They also get Civil Militia, which is the human-based proficiencies in weapons and armor. They get Dark Vision, just like elves, and they get Fey Ancestry, just like elves. So there are some subraces. So you can be a half High Elf, a half Wood Elf, or a half Drow. Half High Elf, you get the cantrip, which is changeable. The Wood Elf, you get the extra 1.5 meters in movement speed. And with the Drow, you get a cantrip called Dancing Lights, which lets you light up a 9 meter area, which is handy to help your non-dark vision players hit the targets at range. Alright, next we have Halflings. Halflings get 7.5 meters, just like dwarves. They also get Lucky, which is a very fun feature. So essentially, if you roll a 1, which is a critical fail, you get to re-roll for an attack, ability check, or a saving throw. So this makes it very hard to critically fail as a halfling. And they get Brave, which gives you an advantage to saving throws against being frightened. So essentially any fear effect. The subraces for halfling are Lightfoot, so those give you an advantage to stealth checks, and Strongheart, and this gives you an additional advantage to saving throws against poison, similar to dwarves. Alright, next on the list is going to be Gnomes. Gnomes get 7.5 meters per turn movement speed, and they also get Gnome Cunning, so you get advantage on Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma saving throws, which covers a wide range of spells. So the subraces are Rock Gnome, which gives you Dark Vision and also gives you Artificer's Lore, so you add twice your proficiency bonus to history checks. There probably aren't too many history checks, but it's nice to have quite a bit of a proficiency bonus if you're picking a gnome. The next one is Forest Gnome. Forest Gnome gets the level 1 divination spell of Speak with Animals, and it also gets Dark Vision. And then Deep Gnome, they get Superior Dark Vision, so they get something similar to Drowse, and they also get Stone Camouflage, so they get advantage on stealth checks. Alright, next is Dragonborn. Dragonborns get 9 meters per turn in movement speed. And then there are many subraces. Essentially, the subraces will give you a action, which is a breath attack of a specific elemental type. So for instance, acid, and then it'll also give you a resistance to that specific elemental type. So for instance, black dragonborns do acid breath, and they also get resistance to acid. Same thing goes for blue dragonborn. They get lightning breath, and then they also get resistance to lightning. Brass is a fire breath and resistance to fire. Bronze is also lightning. Copper is acid. Gold is fire. Green is poison, which is different than acid. Red is fire. Silver is frost breath and cold resistance. And same thing for white, it's frost breath and cold resistance. So those are all the Dragonborn subraces. And last on this list is Half-Orcs. Half-Orcs get the base racial speed of 9 meters per turn. They also get Dark Vision. They get Relentless Endurance, which is probably one of the more min-maxy things you can get out of any of the racial choices. So essentially, if you get hit to be knocked down, so if you get 0 hit points, you instead get to revive with 1 hit point automatically. So it lets you kind of cheat death in a sense, where you can continue fighting even if you were going to be knocked down. But it can be negated if there are a lot of enemies and they all have turns in front of your companions. And they also get Savage Attacks, which is also very min-maxy. So when you land a critical hit, you would normally double the dice damage that you rolled. Well, this instead is tripled dice damage. So you can pull off quite a bit of damage with critical hits, making Half-Orcs probably the best race for combat bonuses. That is all of the races, and like I recommended at the beginning, I would play this more on the lines of role-playing than actually getting major benefits. If you did want to min-max your race, I would say Half-Orc is one of the better combat-oriented races, at the detriment of their appearance, obviously, unless you really like the orc appearance. But overall, each race brings a minimal amount of bonuses to the game, so you can really pick any one of these races, and they could all mesh fairly well with any of the classes that you would choose. Even if they have cantrips that are intelligence based and you choose a non-intelligence based class, it's not going to be that big of a deal. Even if you were playing Tactician, I'd say it still would be possible to complete the game with a non-standard race class combination.
You must gather your party before venturing forth.
Alright, now that we've gone through all of the races, we can now look at this next section, which will be the abilities, skills, and backgrounds. And all of these provide bonuses to our characters in the form of modifiers and proficiencies. And these modifiers and proficiencies affect the underlying dice roll mechanics of the game. So a quick explanation on how the dice mechanic works. So throughout the world, you will encounter certain skill checks, either in conversations, in combat, or even in the open world when you're interacting with objects or just walking by random places. All these skill checks will appear, and some of them will be automatic, but some of them will be manual. So as you can see here, these are one of the manual checks. So when you perform a skill check, you will have a difficulty number that you will need to beat. And in this case, that is 10. And in order to beat it, we have to roll a 20-sided dice. And depending on our roll, we will either succeed or fail our skill check, depending on whether we can get a 10 or higher. However, we can actually boost up our chances of winning by increasing our abilities and our skill proficiencies to add on to the number that we roll. So in this simple case, we just roll the dice, and if we get a 10 or higher, we win, and we've succeeded our sleight of hand dexterity check. But now if we increase our dexterity with these gloves of dexterity to a score of 18, we now get a +4. And these are called modifiers, and modifiers give us a bonus to our roll. So instead of having to roll a 10 or higher, we now have to roll a 6 or higher, because we do get a +4 bonus. So if we roll a 6, we would add on this 4, and we would now equal 10, which would meet the difficulty class that is presented to us for this lock. And this is an example of how adding abilities and skill proficiencies can affect our rolls within the game. Okay, so now that we understand how the dice roll mechanics work, we're going to go over the skills first, because each background has 2 skills associated with it, and we will need to know what these are to better understand which background we should choose. So in order to get to the skills section, you'll have to go to the abilities page and then click on the change button under the skill proficiencies. On this page, we can see the full list of skills that we can use to succeed in many of the situations that we encounter within the game. We will go over each one of these, and I will give an explanation on when you will encounter them. And no one character can be good at everything, so in general, you'll be splitting up these skills among your party members to hopefully cover as many scenarios as possible. So let's go over a few things before we get into the skills. Each skill has a number next to it that shows how much we will add to it when we roll the dice, and there are many ways that we can change that number. We will get a +2 proficiency bonus to 2 skills from our background, and those are indicated by this icon. We can also get some from our race, which will be indicated by this icon, and we can choose them from a limited set based on our class, which is this icon. So in this case, we have the option to choose 2 out of the 5 barbarian skills to gain a proficiency in, which will give us a +2 in each one of those skills. So if I were to choose athletics, I now have a +2 here, and if I were to choose nature, that's also a +2. There are some scenarios where we actually can go beyond +2, and that is called expertise. So if we look at the rogue, we can see a new expertise column, and this is a column that essentially doubles the +2 proficiencies that we get. So in order to use the expertise, you actually already have to have a proficiency within the skills that you want to choose. So if we were to choose athletics, it now opens up the ability to get a ×2 to athletics, which will be +4 total. And this is also shown on the right hand side where it says athletics ×2. And there are also situations where you could have overlap. For instance, if you were to pick a human and a bard, both of those can gain a proficiency in literally any skill. So you have the human section and then you have the bard section for your class. And so if I were to pick like athletics as a human, it removes the option to choose that as a bard. And likewise, if I were to pick one as a bard, we no longer have the option to choose that as a human. And finally, there's actually one more way we can modify this number, and that is with putting points into our abilities. And so as we can see with athletics, we have a +3 in it, and we don't have anything tied to our backgrounds, our race, or even any points into it from our class. So this +3 is actually coming from our strength. So I put in 17 points into strength, and as we hover over it, we can see that we are getting +3 to strength checks. And if we hover over athletics, we can see just below where it says athletics that this is a strength-based ability. So that means that we are getting the +3 from our strength. So when you go through each one of these, you're going to see different abilities associated with your particular skill, and you're going to get a bonus from those abilities to that skill that you can also gain a proficiency in and get an even higher number for those skill checks that you will encounter throughout the world. Alright, so let's look at athletics. Athletics is a strength-based skill check. Athletics is used mostly in combat, and it is used whenever you are going to use the shove action to push someone down. So for instance, if you were on a cliff and you had an enemy in front of you, you can shove them off the cliff if your athletics check passes. And so that is mostly where you're going to use these at. You can use athletics in conversations as well if you are trying to show a physical feat. So for instance, if you are tangling with someone and they are trying to hurt you and you're conversating with them, you might have an athletics check pop up to say, use athletics to push them off of you. And so that's another way you can use athletics. Up next is acrobatics, and it is primarily used if you are the one being pushed in combat. So the enemy in this case would push you using their athletics, and you would have to make a check with your acrobatics to determine if you are shoved. And similar to athletics, there are some times in conversations where you will have to use it, but it is very rare. Up next is sleight of hand. Sleight of hand is also dexterity based, and this is actually one of the most useful skills that you can acquire. And specifically if you are a rogue, you can get a lot of bonuses to sleight of hand. And what sleight of hand does is it helps you when you are picking locks to overcome the lock skill checks. And also when you're disarming traps, it helps you overcome the trap difficulty. And if you are picking pockets, this will also help you overcome those skill checks. So you're going to use this primarily out of combat and primarily outside of conversations as well. So this will be mostly with you interacting with the world. Okay, so up next is going to be stealth, and stealth is also dexterity based, and stealth is used in combat and usually in the world, but not in conversations. You're going to use stealth in combat, primarily if you are a rogue, because stealth is kind of a big part of your combat style, where you will go around a corner, go into stealth, and then start hiding. And what that does is that gives you the ability to get an advantage on your next attack and also deal additional damage with backstab. And if you're in the world, there's going to be situations where you're going to have to stealth around. And what stealth checks do is whenever you hit C, you go into a hiding position. Let's say you counter enemies, and enemies will project these red vision cones all across the area you're trying to travel through. So stealth checks come into play whenever you actually hit that red cone. And so the higher this number, the more likely you are to pass those stealth checks. Up next is Arcana, and Arcana is an intelligence-based skill, and you're not going to use Arcana in combat, and you will rarely use it in the open world. Usually if you walk by a device that is magically attuned, you might have an Arcana check pop up as you walk by it, and your character will have some kind of insight if it does pass that Arcana check, and if it doesn't pass it, then that's kind of it. You don't really get another chance. So Arcana checks will primarily be used in conversations, and it's usually involved if someone is talking about a particular item that is magical, or a particular spell, or someone in general just inquiring about magic, and you're talking to them. You're gonna have a Arcana check pop up, and it could coincide with other checks like history or nature, depending on the context of the conversation. All right, so up next is gonna be history, and history, like Arcana, is never gonna be used in combat. It will rarely be used in the open world. When you walk by, say, a statue that has a historical context about it, your character might do a history check to see if it passes, and it will give you a little more insight about the statue itself. But primarily, you're going to be using history in conversations, and it's going to be in the context of talking about particular historical events or historical items. Up next is investigation, and investigation is another intelligence-based check, and similar to history and Arcana, it is going to be used primarily in conversations, and you might encounter them in the open world if you come across a murder scene or a crime. This is going to be more in line with investigation in context, and likewise in conversations, you might encounter an investigation check very rarely. Up next is nature, and nature is another intelligence-based skill. So you're not going to use nature in combat. You might use it in the open world if you walk by a particular plant or a particular scene involving animals, where your character would recognize it as a nature check and will perform a nature check automatically, and your character may give you more insight into that particular scene. But primarily you're going to be using nature in conversations, and most likely you're going to be using nature when you're talking to people about particular animals or plants. You might have more nature checks than any other checks. So up next is religion, and religion is another intelligence-based check. Religion will not be used in combat at all, and it could be used in the open world if, for instance, you walk by a particular religious deity statue or temple. You're going to have a religion check to determine which deity this temple's for. That's pretty much the context that it's going to occur in. And also, if you're talking to someone about a particular deity, you're also going to have to pass a religion check in order to show them that you know what they're talking about. Right, up next is going to be animal handling, and that is a wisdom-based skill. So typically you would use animal handling in conversations only, so not really in the open world and not in combat at all. And animal handling is primarily going to be used if you do not have the speak with animal spell. So there are a few instances where you use animal handling, particularly if you want to get information from an animal and you can't converse with them. This will help you pass checks in order to use hand gestures and eye contact to gain the animal's trust. So there are a few animals in the world that you can use this on, and they will actually join you in your camp. So you can actually have some animal friends at your camp that you can also talk with or continue using this skill to help them trust you more. Up next is going to be Insight. Insight is a very important conversational skill to have. So you're not going to use this at all in combat, and this is not going to be used in the open world as well. Insight is specifically in conversations, and typically insight checks will pop up when someone may be lying to you. So this could help you gain more information in those conversations that you can use later on when you want to persuade them to kind of see your way or do something that you want them to do. All right, medicine is another wisdom-based skill. So medicine checks are going to be used in conversations exclusively. It's mostly in if you are talking with someone, and this will be a check that can tell you if they are suffering from some kind of condition, like a disease, or if they have possible debuff on them and you're not sure what it is. This can help you uncover what that might be. All right, up next is perception, and perception is a wisdom-based skill. And this is something that you're going to be using primarily in the open world to uncover traps and to uncover hidden levers. And you're going to see a lot of perception checks if you are going through a dungeon. And if you do see a perception check and it fails, I would stop your party from moving and bring someone closer to the person that it failed on so that you can check for traps, or maybe even find like a hidden lever that opens up a door to a treasure area. And if you don't pass any perception checks with any of your characters, you're just going to miss out on whatever they saw, and hopefully it's not a trap and you don't trigger it. And the next one is going to be survival, and survival is another wisdom-based skill, and this skill kind of coincides in the same context of nature. So sometimes you might have conversations with people and you might have the option of choosing either nature or survival. So depending if you're intelligence-based or depending if you're wisdom-based, you might pick one or the other. So you'll never encounter survival checks in combat. You will primarily encounter them in conversations, but there are chances to actually find them in the open world. And usually when you pass a survival check, it's usually you walking by a buried treasure somewhere in the open world, and you can use a shovel to dig up that buried treasure. So always be sure to have your survival character walk around the world, especially in areas that looks like a dead end. There might typically be something there that you could dig up if you pass that survival skill check. All right, up next is deception, and deception is one of the 4 charisma-based skills. So deception, intimidation, and persuasion are typically the ones that you will see when you're trying to convince someone to do something that they do not want to do. So you're never going to use deception in combat, and you're never going to use deception in the open world. These are purely for conversations. And usually with these different types of skills, they each kind of cater to a specific class. So for instance, the deception skill is going to cater more towards like rogues and people that aren't really inclined to be honest. And when you do pass a deception check, you're usually getting out of a situation or getting something out of somebody. And when you choose deception, I would probably just focus in on deception and not like intimidation or persuasion as alternatives, because mostly those checks will all be aligned in the same conversation. All right, the next one is going to be intimidation. Intimidation, just like deception and persuasion, is charisma based. And this is also purely a conversational skill check. And instead of deception, where you're lying to them, you're actually using intimidation and you're threatening them. And as you can see with barbarian, that's your only option. So if you want to convince someone as a barbarian to do something that you want them to do, you have to use intimidation. And then the next one is going to be performance, and performance is charisma based, and this one is generally geared towards bards. And usually if you are using performance, you're not going to be doing this in combat, and they're not really used in the open world. This is mostly going to be used in conversations with someone that also is maybe using an instrument, so you can perform with them and use a performance check to see how well you did with them. Or if you're trying to entertain someone or entertain a group of people, you're going to use this performance check to see how well they react to your performance. All right, up next is going to be persuasion, and persuasion is also another one that you'll only going to be using in conversations. You're not going to be using in combat, or you're not going to be using in the open world. And this is the more neutral way to achieve the goal of having someone do something that they don't want to do. So persuasion will be in one of the options like deception and intimidation, and persuasion will probably be geared more towards like the bards, and maybe even like sorcerers that are able to charm people. You can use persuasion to boost up your chances of getting the things that you want. Okay, so now let's talk about the backgrounds. And one important part about the backgrounds is that you are not able to change these once you get past the character creation screen. And while this doesn't have a big impact on your character, just keep that in mind when you're making your choice. And backgrounds play a few roles, some that are obvious, and some that are not obvious. And one of the obvious ones is you're going to be role-playing a particular character that has this particular history, so you can use this to kind of further form your character and how they would act and react in the world. The next obvious one is that you're going to gain 2 skills that is associated with the background. So as you can see, for Acolyte, you gain Insight and Religion, and each one of these has just 2 skills, but they do change, so that also could drive your decision for your background. And the last role that the background will play in the game that you wouldn't really know unless you were actually playing in the game already is that your background will cause you to get inspiration points. So inspiration points let you re-roll a dice when you are performing a skill check in a conversation. So if you fail a skill check in a conversation, you're usually done. But if you have an inspiration point, you can click re-roll and it will allow you to re-roll that dice as if you didn't roll the first one. So it's kind of a selective advantage in that sense. And how you get these inspiration points is by performing actions in the world that will inspire you based on the background that you choose. So if you are an entertainer and you see a performance that you like, that will give you an inspiration point. And it will tell you, so-and-so has got an inspiration point from this particular event. So you'll see those pop up throughout the game. So there are actually a lot of events in the world that give inspirations to all the different backgrounds, but you can choose to do things that would line up with what you think your background would do. So if you are a folk hero and someone says they need help and you help them, you're most likely going to get an inspiration point for that. Alright, so let's quickly go through the different backgrounds now. Okay, the first we're going to look at is going to be Acolyte. An Acolyte is going to be someone who works in a temple and performs like religious rites. So they're going to be someone who's inspired by religious ceremonies, or maybe something that's related to like a deity or honoring a deity. And the skills that they have are Insight and Religion. Up next is a Charlatan, and a Charlatan is someone who's like a con man, someone who just manipulates people. And they're going to get inspiration from situations where you're kind of lying to someone and you're causing them to do things for you in a manipulative way. So that's what's going to inspire them, and they get bonuses to Deception and Sleight of Hand. All right, up next is a Criminal, and a criminal is someone who is breaking the law or has broken the law, and they're going to be inspired by, breaking the law, stealing things, stealing important things, maybe connecting with other criminals, and their skills are going to be Deception and Stealth. And up next is going to be Entertainer. Entertainers are people that perform for audiences. Maybe they see a performance and that inspires them. So if you're an entertainer, you would probably seek out those types of performances, or maybe people singing and doing different acts for entertainment purposes. And their skills are Acrobatics and Performance. Then you have Folk Hero, someone who's kind of looks out for the little guy, always like fighting monsters and helping people. And so they're going to be inspired by saving people and doing things for people that wouldn't be able to do themselves. And their skills are Animal Handling and Survival. All right, next is going to be Guild Artisan. So a Guild Artisan is someone who is really good at crafting certain items. So you're going to be inspired by seeing very well crafted things, or maybe admiring them in a conversation with somebody. And they get bonuses to Insight and Persuasion. All right, next is going to be Noble. And Noble is someone who is from high society and someone who has a very refined taste for a lot of things. So they're going to be inspired by maybe completing quests for very high profile people, or for doing things for people that are very famous in a sense. And their skills are History and Persuasion. Then we have Outlander. So Outlander is someone who is in like a survival situation. They grew up far out from the city, and they're going to be probably inspired by, doing things that require survival, or overcoming different survival types of situations, or doing quests that, would lead you out into remote areas. And the 2 skills that you get with them are going to be Athletics and Survival. The next one's going to be Sage. And Sage is someone who is seeking knowledge and learning about different parts of the world. And a Sage is someone who's going to be constantly reading, and they're going to be inspired by learning something new that's very rare. So maybe like reading a very rare book and getting some insight from that book. And the skills that they have are going to be Arcana and History. All right, next is going to be Soldier. So Soldier is someone who is tactically trained in combat and knows how to fight on a battlefield with a company or some kind of group. And so they're going to be inspired by accomplishing. They're going to be someone that is going to be inspired by, tactically defeating an enemy or completing a quest that's going to require some kind of tactics or battlefield prowess. And the skills that they have are Athletics and Intimidation. And finally, we have Urchin. An Urchin is someone who's been poor and has to use their street smarts to survive. So you're going to be someone who is inspired by seeing other people or helping other people overcome their situations that involve being poor and maybe getting benefits out of that. And the skills that they bring are going to be sleight of hand and stealth. Alright, so those are all the backgrounds and all the skills. I hope this helps you with seeing how this plays a larger part into the game. Most of these are not really combat focused. This is more of the other side of the game when you're going to be talking with people or interacting with the world, which is still a massive part of the game since combat makes up probably less than half of what you'll encounter.
You must gather your party before venturing forth.
And finally, we will end this episode with abilities. And abilities do play a huge role in our combat. And as we saw, they also play a role in how we use our skills outside of combat as well. So we already went over what parts of the abilities do. And abilities are something that we can change when we respec our character. So we don't have to worry about making mistakes on the screen because we can change these as soon as we have access to that respec option. And the abilities that we pick will be solely driven by our class. So the class that we pick will determine what abilities we pick. And there's a little bit of a flexibility within that. And so the class that we choose will give us a star next to the primary ability that is associated for that class. So for the barbarian, it is going to be strength, since a barbarian is strength based. So that is the ability we want to max out first on this character before we put points into other abilities. And that should be our highest one on the screen. There are other secondary stats that can be focused on, and that does get more complicated if you're trying to multi-class later. So what we can do now is look at each ability individually, and I can go over what each one of those does so that whenever you go into more advanced options like multi-classing, it's going to require you to put more thought into your ability points. At least then you will know what each one of those does, and you can make a better, more informed decision. So on the screen, we have the option to actually remove all of our ability points. And we have to manually uncheck these 2 bonus points that we're given in replacement of the ones that were assigned by races previously. Since races have no effect on our ability points, these 2 options here will give us the option to have our main one, obviously, but then we have an option to put a point into our secondary stat that we want to focus on. And so without these 2 options checked, the max we can go is 15, and that goes for all abilities. And so you can actually have 15 in 2 different abilities, and the other ones are going to suffer for that. And that is an option, and you might want to do this if you're going to be playing a very simple class, and you can actually go below 10 in certain stats. And what this does is this actually will give you a negative modifier. So we see here we now have a -1 to intelligence checks. So whenever we roll a dice like I showed before in the skill section, this is, instead of giving us a plus bonus, we will now have a negative bonus if we're trying to do a specific intelligence check and we don't have any proficiencies. Alright, so if you get to the screen and you're just picking a single class that you're going to play with for a while, I would just recommend hitting this use recommended option, and this will best distribute the ability points that fit that specific class. And it makes it pretty easy to not have to spend a lot of time on this particular screen. So let's go through each one of these. There are 6 different abilities we can specialize in, and the first one is strength. And so outside of the strength checks that we talked about earlier, there are things called saving throws, and saving throws are kind of an in-combat skill check. And these will usually occur if someone casts a spell. You'll have to do a specific saving throw that is specifically tied to each of these abilities. So if you have a high stat in a specific saving throw, you're going to be better at handling certain types of enemies. The other thing that strength does, there are certain weapons that get bonuses from strength, where strength is the primary stat for that particular weapon. And those are pretty much all weapons except for ranged weapons and finesse weapons. So strength and dexterity will cover most of the weapons that you encounter in the world. And that's mostly like your heavier weapons, like the 2-handed axes and swords. So another thing that plays a role in the game that you wouldn't think wouldn't be a big deal, but it actually is strength determines how far you can jump. And there are many situations where you're going to be jumping across ledges and you realize you can't get there with certain characters. So you might have to do something with like spells or trying to figure out a way to get across that ledge. And finally, strength also plays a factor into how much you can carry. Alright, up next is going to be dexterity, and there are a wide range of uses for dexterity. Dexterity will affect your ranged weapons, and it will also affect the melee finesse weapons like rapiers and daggers, stuff like that. And the other important parts of dexterity that all classes can benefit from is dexterity will affect your initiative. So whenever you start combat, you roll a 20-sided die, and you get an initiative modifier, which is directly based on your dexterity modifier. So the higher your dexterity, the more likely it is you will be ahead of your enemies when combat starts. And dexterity also affects your armor class, so the more dexterity you have, the more armor you have, and the harder you are to hit. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is Constitution. And Constitution saving throws usually involve you trying to pass a check on whether you get sick from something or not, or certain debuffs like poisons will also be affected by Constitution saving throws. So the higher your Constitution, the more likely it is you can withstand poisons. And then Constitution also plays a factor into how many hit points you get. So your hit point maximum will be affected directly by your Constitution modifier. So the higher your Constitution, the more hit points you'll wind up with. And so Constitution is definitely useful in surviving many encounters. And so a lot of classes will use Constitution as a secondary stat to put points in. Up next is Intelligence. And Intelligence is primarily used by wizards. And there's a lot of saving throws that require Intelligence. Mostly spells that attack the mind and spells that do psychic damage. If you are not a wizard, you're not really going to be putting points into Intelligence. Especially if you're melee, you can definitely sacrifice all your points in Intelligence and put points into other areas like Constitution to get more hit points. But if you're a wizard, you're going to be sacrificing other ability points, usually something like Charisma. And wizards gain a benefit from Intelligence by using that as their base stat when they cast spells. And what that means is that whenever they cast spells, their chance to hit will be affected by their Intelligence modifier. And this is specifically for wizards. Most other casters will use Wisdom or Charisma. And so as a wizard, you're definitely forced into speccing all your points into Intelligence at the very least, and then putting points probably into Constitution and Dexterity so that you can remain alive. Alright, up next is Wisdom. And Wisdom, like Intelligence, is primarily used for avoiding damage from saving throws, and also it's primarily used for certain casters such as clerics, druids, and rangers. So their base stat for seeing whether they hit with spells is going to be driven by Wisdom. And so if you are one of those classes, you're going to be having all your points into Wisdom. And it also gives you the benefit of having high perception. So if you're one of those classes, you're probably going to want to spec into perception, because perception is also a very important skill. And finally, Charisma is specifically set up for Charisma-based classes. And that's quite a few of them. There's bards, there's paladins, sorcerers, and warlocks. All of those are casting classes that get spell bonuses from their charisma. And charisma saving checks occur to avoid enchantments. But other than that, if you're not one of those classes, you're not really going to be putting too many points into charisma, because it's definitely a waste of points. Unlike something like Constitution and Dexterity, which benefits every class, charisma only benefits those specific classes. If you're a charisma-based class, you're going to be putting your skill points in something like Persuasion, because that's going to benefit you more than the non-charisma based classes. Alright, so that is a lot of information to digest. We went over races, we went over skills, and we went over abilities and also backgrounds. So we've kind of tackled probably half of character customization in this episode. In the next episode, we will go over the rest of character customization. So that'll be the part 2 for episode 0, and the primary content for that one will be the classes. So if you've made it this far, I appreciate your support. You are the reason why I make these videos and go in depth on topics like this. So if you enjoyed this video, please give me a like to help the channel grow. And once again, I thank you, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.